Hello, darling. I was thinking some stuff, and it seemed worth sharing. I was thinking about the rules that we follow, and how we choose them. When I was a teenage boy, as best I remember, I didn't like rules. I rather thought that a lot of rules were echoes of a world now mostly dead, still trying to cling on to life and trick us into continuing traditions that we would be better off forgetting. The world seemed to be full of rules about which cutlery to use when, or who it was important to show proper polite deference to. To me, a lot of this stuff felt very old-fashioned. It is hard for me to tell, in hindsight, how many of these memories I am editing. I can't deny that most of the rules that I remember disliking are the ones that I still dislike today. It is, of course, possible that I also disliked a lot of rules that I have since come around to, and that I am now conveniently forgetting that. Who could know for sure? Back then, I was reading books that talked about people being conditioned by society to be obedient little robots, brainwashed into living narrow lives, constrained by peer pressure into conformity for fear of censure. I didn't want to think of myself as one of those people, and I tried my best to overcome that conditioning, to teach myself to break the rules, to walk through the walls of my cell. I remained, for the most part, a perfectly polite young man. I didn't enjoy being rude to people or upsetting them. The experiment that I was involved in didn't insist that the rules never be followed. The point was that I would have a choice, that I could choose how I behaved, not be constrained to just one narrow path through fear or blindness. I distinctly remember realizing that many of the so-called rules of society were not enforced nearly so well as I had expected. The rules were pretty clear, for example, that I had to do my French homework. Imagine my joy, therefore, when I discovered that I could simply not do my French homework, and that there would be no immediate consequences. I definitely felt superior, I am ashamed to say, in hindsight, to those other students in my French class who were still slaving over their homework. I probably thought that they were fools. I probably laughed at them as robots conditioned by society. I should note, for the record, that they did all get much, much better grades than I did in their final French exams. Ah well, such are the follies of youth. Even when I left school and grew up, I never entirely lost this attitude to rules. My political stance was closer to anarchist than it was to anything else. I was a polite anarchist, but an anarchist for all of that. I remember watching a couple of documentaries about the Summerhill experiment and being fascinated by the idea of a school in which the children decide what the rules are. It was definitely something that caused me concern when I first considered becoming a teacher myself in my late 20s. I knew that the job would require me to put kids into detention for bunking off games, for example. I wasn't sure that I'd be able to do the job well enough to remain employable. As it turned out, I was fine. I was always quite clear with those kids that I put into detention for bunking games that I was very irritated with them for putting me in this position. Much of the time, I was free to ignore the rules that I didn't think were important. It always seemed to me that the pupils met the idea of a teacher who didn't give much of a damn about, for example, uniform regulations, with the kind of wry familiarity that suggested that I was not the only member of staff who took this approach. I don't tell this story with any illusion that I have the moral high ground in any way. I am quite aware of the research that shows that consistency between teachers in applying the rules is the key to a smoothly functioning school. My lax attitude towards uniform, for example, would certainly have made life harder for many of my colleagues. They were just trying to do their job, and I'm not proud of having made that job tougher. We have established that I was able to remain employable as a teacher, but I'm certainly not claiming that I was ever entirely good at it. Throughout my life, though, I have often reacted to people who break the rules with a mixture of envy and respect. I do have a dislike of cruelty or of deliberately causing people pain. As such, I am a big fan of any rules that are meant to protect people from the cruelty or sadism of others. I feel no respect or envy towards the people who break those rules. Over the years, I have come to balance my fundamentally anarchist principles with an understanding that the rules of politeness and the other guidelines that govern human interaction in modern society are a useful social lubricant that lets us rub along beside one another in a crowded city without actively coming to blows. I am also very aware that it is normal and acceptable for the human animal to feel the effects of peer pressure. For most people, our brains are wired as social animals. We have evolved to function in groups and benefit greatly from the advantages of being part of a community. For much of human history, an individual human would have struggled to survive. Exile from the tribe was all too often a death sentence. In the modern world, it is more possible than it used to be, if you have money, to survive almost entirely alone, with no real sense of community connection. But that does not mean that those people find that they are necessarily happy. I read posts online where people talk about some argument or disagreement and seek reassurance that it was not them who were entirely in the wrong, that they weren't the arsehole in this interaction. This hunger for reassurance or validation from others feels very tangled up with our primal fear of being exiled from the tribe. Someone was angry with us, as if we had broken the rules, and we need to double-check and make sure they were wrong about that. I like the implicit sense in this that we are all of us running by our own personal rules. The current fashion in this age of the individual is to think of the rules that we try to live by as expressions of our own identity, as extensions of our personality. We recognize that someone else's rules might be different from our own without either of us necessarily being wrong. I can imagine a kind of bell curve for the range of socially acceptable behaviours in a given situation. The people making the "Am I the arsehole" posts realise that not everyone would have reacted exactly the same way they did. They just want to find out where in the bell curve they are. They're hoping that they're somewhere in that big middle bit. The narrow bits at each end can get kind of scary for a social animal. I do still have a side of me that isn't entirely comfortable following the rules. But I console myself that these days rules tend not to be dictated by books on etiquette or by sermons from pulpits, and aren't even really laid down by governments for the most part. The majority of the rules I find myself following are precisely the ones that a good anarchist ought to follow. They are arrived at by consensus within communities, and as such they are the price of admission to those communities. I do get to choose how I behave, just like everybody else does, but if I choose to break those rules repeatedly, then I am choosing exile from those communities. I sometimes read things that ask me to consider what advice I would give if I could go back and talk to my teenage self. I realise that that's the sort of thing that many people find it very interesting to think about. I have to confess, though, that this is one of those times when I find myself way out at that scary narrow bit of the bell curve. I would have almost nothing to say to my teenage self. I mean, I get that I could warn him about the French homework, but I think that I remember him well enough to know that I'd be wasting my breath. I have deliberately chosen to live my life almost entirely without regret. I'm not suggesting that I have nothing that I could regret or should regret, just that I have almost nothing that I do regret. I kind of decided to be like that a long time ago, and I don't think I could change now even if I wanted to. If I was in a room with my teenage self, I think almost the only advice I would give him would be on dental hygiene. I do get that that makes me genuinely weird. I am kind of hoping that it isn't bad enough to get me exiled from the tribe. Anyway, that's what I was thinking about. And, scary though it was, I decided to share it. See you soon.